Sunday school this morning. And so we have, over these past 13 weeks, have gone from Genesis to the book of Ruth. And so it covers different time periods. And so today is going to be a review. Next week, Ed Woods will be with us, so all the Sunday school classes will be together to be able to hear what's been going on with the mission work that Ed Woods has been involved in. And on the 10th, up in this class, we'll begin the Kings and Prophets. And then for the other adult class downstairs, it's going to be evangelism. So you get to choose from which one that you wish to attend. And that will be for 12 weeks. So April, May, and June. And then in July, we'll switch. And downstairs will be a course on, I think it's marriage or it's finances, one of those two. And then we're going to either finish up Old Testament, so looking at wisdom literature, or we will do how to study the Bible. So I'm not sure which one we'll do yet, but that is the plan. All right, so let's go ahead and ask the Lord's blessing for our time together. Father, we just do thank you for being able to be here, and we just pray that as we look into your word, that you would help us to be able to understand as we review the books, the major concepts, the things that are very, very important in each book. And may it help us to be better students of your word in the days ahead. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we've been going, as we said already, from Genesis through Judges, and it encompasses quite a bit of time, so we'll be kind of doing a review. And the first thing I kind of want to review from that is how we look at the Old Testament. So the Old Testament, as it's organized in what we call the usual Protestant canon. So the 39 books of the Old Testament, we have them in a different order than the order that the Jewish people look at the Old Testament. And so we usually break up the canon of the Old Testament into four categories. The Pentateuch, which are often called the Law of Moses, and those would be the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then we have what we call historical books. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And of course, Genesis through Deuteronomy does cover some history, but the historical books is what we have there. And then you have the poetic books. We call them poetry, or sometimes even wisdom, would be Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then the last major category is as the prophets, and we look at them as being major and minor prophets. And the reason for that is usually it's called major because the books are longer and then the minor. But you look at some of the minor prophets, some of the letters are long too. So I'm not sure exactly what they determined was, is it word count or whatever. But the major prophets would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then your minor prophets would be Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. As we think about the Jewish canon and how the Jewish canon breaks it up, the Old Testament, the Jewish have it as 24 books. And the reason for ours having 39 but them having 24 is, for example, they have one book called the 12. And so what we would call the minor prophets, and call them different books, actually the Jewish canon would look at it as being one book together. And then, for example, we would have something such as 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Well, they don't make that distinction that there's 2 books of the Kings. They just call it Kings, they call it Samuel, they call it Chronicles. And then like Ezra and Nehemiah, we have it as 2 separate books. Ezra and Nehemiah in the Jewish canon is considered one book. So they call that the Tanakh. And so they break it up into 3 major categories. One is called the Torah. We would call it also Law of Moses, which is the first 5 books. And then you have the Nevi'im. And the Nevi'im is with three categories. They call the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then the later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12, what we would call minor prophets, they have it as one book. And then the Ketuvim is broken up into wisdom, which is Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. And then the Megillot, which is 5 books that compose it, Song of Songs, or what we would call the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And then the history books they call Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and then Chronicles. So different way how they view the canon. But one of the things that we discussed is that oftentimes when the Old Testament as a whole is being referred to, it is often referred to as the Moses and the prophets. And so that's kind of encompassing the whole Bible. As we kind of take a look at some general timelines, and this is a timeline of the Old Testament as a whole. We didn't cover everything because we've only gone through the book of Judges and Ruth as far as the time period. But if you look at it, you have about 4000 BC is creation, and then the flood of Noah at 2348, and then, of course, the birth of Abraham. That's very important because of the Abrahamic Covenant. And then you also have the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. And then, of course, the period of the Judges. About 1050, 1040, right around in there, is the united monarchy, which is Saul, David, and Solomon. And then you have the divided monarchy, where you have a northern and a southern kingdom. And then another big date is where the northern kingdom goes into exile in 722, and the southern kingdom, when the temple is destroyed and they go into exile, is 586. And then several years later, you have Cyrus's decree for the people to return to Jerusalem, and they rebuild the temple, or they construct what is called the Second Temple, and that begins in Jewish history. They call it the Second Temple period. And then Nehemiah comes back, and about 440 BC, the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. And then, of course, Jesus' birth, which is about 4 BC. So that's kind of the Old Testament as a whole. But we want to focus on from creation to Judges that we have covered. Now, this is a chart you don't have, but this chart helps us to understand how things all fit together from what we've looked at in a historical perspective. And basically, we're looking at about 3,000 years of history that we have covered. So the creation to the end of the Judges. And so you notice on the timeline about 4004 BC, which is creation, and then 1042 BC, or around 1050, 1042 BC is when you have the monarchy that begins and the time of the Judges ends. Now, I didn't put in a lot of the timeline based upon dates, just a few things in there. I want us just to see more about the major people and then also the books and how that they all fit in and intertwined with one another. And then really when you think about Genesis through Deuteronomy, those books are successive books. And if you remember where Deuteronomy and Numbers begins, it begins with a conjunction and, which means it's being joined to the books that go before it. So you have a succession that takes place. So you can see Genesis on the chart goes to about 1695 BC, which would be the death of Joseph. And then you have a short period of time, and then the book of Exodus picks up from there, and the people are in captivity, and God raises up Moses to bring them out of Canaan. And then once they are brought to Mount Sinai, you have the construction of the temple, of the tabernacle. And once that's erected, that ends the book of Exodus. Then you have Leviticus, which is actually a very, very short period of time, just only about a month. And Leviticus covers, well, now that you have the tabernacle, then how are things to work? How's the priesthood to work? How are the offerings to be done? What are the feast days? What are the Sabbaths? And so Leviticus lays all of that out. And then you begin Numbers. And Numbers really covers the people's rejection to go into the land of Canaan. They don't trust God. So you have the 40 years of captivity. And then after the 40 years of captivity, once they come out, you have the Book of Deuteronomy. And so there are a couple battles that are fought. And then Moses begins to prepare this next generation with the law so that they know what they are to do once they are in the land. And so Deuteronomy ends with a change in leadership from Moses to Joshua. And Moses dies. Well, then that picks up what we call the book of Joshua, and that is where they enter into the land of Canaan. And there are 3 campaigns. There's a central campaign, which is Jericho and Ai. And then, of course, you have the Gibeonites that are in there, but that is not a battle. And then you have a southern campaign and a northern campaign. And that encompasses part of Joshua. And then about the midpoint of Joshua, once they have not taken over all the nations, but sufficient amount, then the land is allotted. Once the land is allotted to each of the tribes, Joshua dies, and then they enter the time of the judges. They could not drive all the nations out because they were not depending upon God. And so God, you see the cycle of the people of Israel sinning against God, falling away from Him, and then you have the oppression that they face. Then they cry out to God for help, and God in His mercy and in His compassion raises up a judge to deliver them. The judge delivers them, and then there's a time of peace, and then all of a sudden the cycle begins all over again. And you see a total of 6 cycles in the book of Judges. But while the cycles within Judges are ongoing, you have the book of Ruth. And it begins with Ruth during the time when the judges ruled. And it happens to be that the events of Ruth take place when the nation, or should I say when Judah as a tribe, has not been faithful to God and they are being oppressed. Because it tells us there was a famine in the land. And so one of the things that God said in Deuteronomy to the people of Israel, if you stay faithful to me, you'll have the rain, you'll have everything you need at the perfect time, I will abundantly bless you. But if you depart from me, then I will withhold the rain. I will bring enemies upon you. I will, and you have the curses. And so for Naomi and her family to go down to Moab tells us, because of the famine, Judah was not faithful to the Lord. So it's during one of the negative cycles in which they go back. And of course, they start living among the Moabites. And as they live among the Moabites, the 2 boys get married. And then, of course, her husband, Naomi's husband, and her 2 sons die. And Ruth says, I'm staying with you, Naomi. And so they decide it's time to go back to our home in Bethlehem. So they travel back up to Judah, to Bethlehem. And then, of course, that is where Ruth is gleaning in the field, meets Boaz. Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. And then we see the genealogy of that Ruth gives birth to Obed. Obed gives birth to Jesse, or Obed does not, but Obed's wife does. And then, of course, the son of Jesse is David. And that's really important because, we'll see, of course, Christ being of the line of David. So a very important marker in there. And, of course, as far as some of the major people in Genesis, you, of course, have Adam and Eve. But we have Noah during the time of the flood. And then you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. And then there's a period of time after Joseph dies is where God calls Moses, and Moses leads the people of Israel up to the point of entering the land of Canaan. But Joshua, he served under Moses and then took over the leadership from Moses when God appointed him. And then that is some really kind of the major players. We don't have each of the judges listed, but they are major players in there as well. But this is just kind of a basic timeline of what we've covered and how the books fall in line with one another. One of the things also that we covered was a lot of maps, and so we'll take a look at some things here. And when we look at the map here, and I'm just trying to get everything all settled. This right here, between the Euphrates and between the Tigris River, is often what is called, that whole green area, the Fertile Crescent. Now, rivers do meander a little bit, and then, of course, with the flood, things may have changed a little bit. But basically, it's within that area is where the Garden of Eden, that God placed it. And that is, of course, where God created Adam and Eve and placed them in the garden. So that is kind of what we often call not only the Fertile Crescent, but sometimes it's called the beginning of civilization. And so it's within that region. And then, of course, over into here, you see the arrow. Up top, right about in here, is the Sea of Galilee. And that begins the Jordan River, and that runs down to what is called the Dead Sea. And then on the western side of that is Israel. And then below here, over in this area, the wilderness Berean, or the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, the Exodus, the giving of the law, is within that area. And then over here, you see the Nile River, and of course, that's part of Egypt. And so Egypt is down in here. And so really, all the events that we think about from creation to the time of the Judges, you're looking at this big area right in here. And it seems this big area is where everything is transpiring. Now, as we go a little bit further, and we can see here that this is important because we have what is called the Table of Nations. So after the flood, the three sons of Noah are told to spread out and to repopulate the earth. And so Ham, he settles in what is this area right here. And of course, here's Mount Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula. So this is Egypt. And as you go down from there, from Egypt, you go down into Africa. So the descendants of Ham settled in that region. You can see Japheth, which is this red section up here. That would be what we kind of call Indo-European. So most of us are descendants of the Indo-European region. And so that is where our ancestry traces back to. And then Shem, and the term you think of is Semites or Shem. It is that people group that trace back to Shem that settle in this area that we would call, for the most part, the Middle East. So that is kind of where people groups settle. And then, of course, Genesis 10 gives us 70, or what we call the Table of 70 Nations. And so as you look at the map, you see different names. And each of those different names are people groups that are descendants from Japheth. And so you can kind of see a little bit on the map how the earth was repopulated and where descendants basically settled and where ancestries can be traced back to. And then, of course, we can always trace back to Adam and Eve as well. So that's something we saw in Genesis. Here is, as we got into the book of Exodus, we looked at, okay, the people are in captivity. So, interestingly, I'll go back to this map real quick. So Abraham was living somewhere in here. And then when God called him to leave, he settled up into here for a while. And then he traveled down to see the land that God had given to him. And of course, with a famine, he also came down into Egypt for food. So that's where Abraham was, and he travels up, and then he comes down to Egypt, and then he leaves Egypt, and he is basically settling in that region about where that land is that God has given to them. So that is really important. Now, also important in Genesis is there's two covenants that really come to the forefront. What we call the Noahic covenant, where God promised that he was not going to flood the earth again. But then you have the Abrahamic covenant, where God says, I will give you a land, I will give you a seed, and you'll have many, many children, but then also I will bless you. So the land, the seed, and the blessing are part of the Abrahamic covenant. All right, so after Abraham dies, of course, you have Jacob, and Jacob and them, they are living in this region, which they are setting up, but then there's famine. So Jacob and his family go down to Egypt as well, and there they settle in the land of Goshen. That land is given to them during Joseph's time, and that is where they're living. Well, eventually they become slaves in Egypt, and God is going to bring his people out. And so God brings them out of Egypt, where that they cross, and as they cross this area, they go down into Sinai. And it is probably in this area right in here is Mount Sinai, where God gave them the law. And in the law, he covers many different things for the people of Israel. And then from there, they begin to travel, and they come up into this Berean area. And the big area, and a very important one, is Kadesh Barnea, because that is where they send out the spies, and the spies come back, and 10 of them have a negative report. And so all the people say, we're not going. And then begins the 40 years of wandering, which is in this area in here. And they're just like nomads for 40 years. Well, then God is going to bring them from here with the second generation, and they are going to travel up towards this area, and then they're going to enter into the land of Canaan. And so that's a little bit about Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy from a geographic standpoint where that they are going to be. And then the big thing, of course, with Exodus is not only the giving of the law, but you have the tabernacle. And there are three parts to the tabernacle. You have this one, which is what we would call the outer court. And then the priests were allowed to enter into this area right here, which is called the holy place. Within the holy place, right here, is a veil. And that veil is the entrance into the holiest of holies. So people would come into the outer court to bring their sacrifice. The animals would be slaughtered there, and there was the altar where they would burn things right there. And then before the priests would go in is the brazen laver. It was the place that they would wash to make sure that they are clean. And then when they entered in, there were different items there. And just before the veil was the altar of incense. And that is where the smoke would rise. And the priest would use that smoke, and it would enter into the most holy place before the priest would enter on the Day of Atonement. So this is a little bit about it. And then, of course, you have these curtains that go all the way around that section off the tabernacle. Another picture that what we learned when the ark would travel, God would travel, the tabernacle would have to travel with them, and the people of Israel were to camp around the tabernacle. And God told the tribes which side of the tabernacle they were to pitch their tents. But what would be between them and the people? You notice a row here, and there would be a row here, and a row here, and a row here. That would be the priests. So you have the tabernacle, the priests would live around it, and then around them in this area would be the 12 tribes, and where that they would have to pitch their tents. So the center of focus, the whole focus for the people of Israel, was the tabernacle. Everything about life evolved around that tabernacle. So that is there. And then, of course, within the tabernacle were different furnishings. And so you would have, as you see right here, the altar of burnt offerings. So when the animal was killed, that's the where the animal would be placed, the parts of it that would be burned. And then you have the basin, which was the ceremonial washings. And that is where the priests would wash their hands and make sure that they are clean before they would enter into the holy place. Once you got into the holy place, you had this item, which is one of them, was the table of showbread. And then you would also have the lampstand, and they used oil in the lampstand. And then you had right here the altar of incense, and that would be the one just before the door going into the most holy place. And then, of course, the only item in the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant. And so those were the furnishings that you find there. One of the things that we looked at is the calendar of events from Exodus to the plains of Moab. And, it covers Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as far as the travelings. And you would think, boy, that must be, a lot of time. And actually, it isn't. The Exodus begins the Jewish calendar, which is year 1. And if you notice, it's really only about 42 years of history that's covered in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so some of the things only take place for a period of like 20 days, or only takes place for a month. So while you can, we had this chart, and over here we had all the verses, and it helps us with the time frame as to when all these events are taking place. So it's a really neat chart and a really good one. Okay, well, after the 40 years wanderings and Moses prepares the nation and then Moses dies, you have the time of Joshua. And before we get into that one, we're going to take a look at the different campaigns. So here's a map of Canaan. And here, down right here, is the Jordan River. So they camped about in here, where Joshua prepares the people for crossing the land. They crossed the Jordan, and they set up in a town or a location called Gilgal. Gilgal becomes their base of operations. And then it begins what we call the central campaign. And basically, in a way, you're cutting the land in half. So they fight at Jericho. They then fight at Ai. Now from there are two different campaigns. There is a southern campaign, which comes down to here. And then this is the northern campaign, which they branch out a little bit and take over things there. So they are now in sufficient control of the land of Canaan. Now, as we look at how Joshua allotted the land, you can see here each of the tribes. And when the tribes, and this is the thing, 2.5 tribes did not enter the land. God told all the tribes to enter. The problem was 2.5 tribes liked the land on the other side, and they wanted to remain there. Unfortunately, what Moses did is that Moses made a bargain with them. If you help us, then you can live in that side of the land. And so that was a bad decision by Moses. But nonetheless, the decision was made. That comes up for discussion with Joshua because the 2.5 tribes says, remember, you need to remember the deal that Moses made, and you need to honor the deal that Moses made with us. And Joshua says, well, if you come fight with us, then when it's done, you can go back to the land that you have. That became a big problem for the 2.5 tribes later on. Well, after all this, they fought the battles. It's now time to distribute the land. And so you can see here on this map, it's color-coded with each of the tribes of Israel and where exactly they are allotted the land. And the land size is basically based upon how big the tribes are. So that is just a map with the allotment of the land. And then, of course, what this map also shows us, and there's some red marks, and this is something you have on the handout. We have these red ones right here. These are all what we call the judges of Israel. And the judges of Israel were not judges one right after another over the whole nation. The people wanted a king, which means they wanted one person to unite them all. What they are acting as during the time of the judges is as tribes. Yes, we are the nation of Israel, but all the governance and everything landed upon the tribes. So not did always every tribe go into a time of falling away from the Lord. It could be that it was just Judah. And if it was Judah, God would raise up a judge to deliver Judah. And so that is an important thing to remember, is that you're looking at, in a sense, 12 sovereign tribes who are governing themselves. And the judges are over the tribes in which they are delivering. So you can kind of see where many of the judges are located from and what takes place there. And so that is a lot about geography, a timeline standpoint, and just some of the major things that you find within each of the books. So, with that being said, we take a look at the different books that we went through. And I got to get to the right slide here. And we dealt with Genesis. And as we looked at Genesis, we kind of broke it up into two sections. The first 11 chapters is a book about beginnings. A beginning of the world, beginning of the human race, and the beginning of nations. Then out of all those nations, God is going to choose one to be his nation. We know that to be Israel. And in chapters 12 through 50, you have the beginnings of Israel as a nation. And you have the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then you also have Joseph. And then as we looked at creation, which of course is very important, it took place over 6 days. 6 literal days of creation. The first day was the heavens and the earth and the light. The second day was separating the waters above from the waters below. The third day is the dry land and vegetation. The fourth day is the sun, the moon, and the stars. The fifth day is the sea and the flying creatures. And then, of course, the sixth day is the land animals as well as Adam. And so you have the 6 days of creation, 6 literal, what we would call 24-hour days that make up of creation. So evolution does not accord with the Bible. But then there was, back in the early 1900s, another type of theological system called theistic evolution. That, well, we believe in creation, but we also believe in evolution. And so we need to meld these two together. And I don't believe theistic evolution accords with the Bible because it takes evolution as being over a huge amount of time rather than just 6 literal days. And so that is something we had discussed back then. So that was a little bit there. Of course, Babel is very important, and that is where the human race came together to challenge God. And Babel was an attempt to unify man under one government, under one religion, led by a person, Nimrod. And the tower that they built was probably a ziggurat or a temple, and that was the place that they would come to worship. Babel is really important to remember because when you get to the book of Revelation, the idea of mystery Babylon comes back. And it's once again the human race uniting together to challenge God. And you have one government, one religion, and you have the Antichrist false prophet, and of course Jesus Christ comes back and he establishes his kingdom. So Babel in Genesis is made reference to many times, especially in the book of Revelation, and it always comes back to this Genesis account and what went on there. So that is really important. Okay, that is basically the book of Genesis as we went through it. As we take a look at the book of Exodus, let's see, where are we? The major divisions of the book of Exodus, you have their slavery in Egypt, God's redemption of them, and their travel to Mount Sinai. You then have the covenant between God and between the people of Israel being established, known as the Mosaic Covenant. And then you have the construction of the temple. And so that is the major aspects of there. And then Leviticus is really a continuation of the book of Exodus. And what you find is these are where the laws are being given. Laws about the offerings and the sacrifices. The inauguration of the priesthood and the instructions of how the priesthood is to function. You then have laws given to the people for purity, to know the distinction between clean and unclean. Of course, the Day of Atonement is a very important part in Leviticus. And then just day in and day out life, their practices and their actions, there are laws that are given there. And then within that, you have the establishment of the very important feast days or holidays for the people of Israel. So you have Passover, and immediately after Passover is unleavened bread, and then after unleavened bread is first fruits. And then you have the Feast of Weeks, which is also called Pentecost. Those are what they call the spring feasts. When you get into what they call the fall feasts, you have the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And then this one here, Hanukkah, but Hanukkah is not an official God-sanctioned holiday. It's recognized, but it has not been instituted by God. The same way with Purim, which was during the time of Esther. It becomes something that is decreed by Esther, and the people of Israel follow it, but it was not established by God. And so you have those that are there. And then, so those are the different feasts that they have, and that's just another chart there of the different feast days that there were for the people of Israel according to the Jewish calendar. So that kind of lays it out there as well. So that is the book of Leviticus. Just one thing we also talked about was the high priest and the garments, very elaborate garments that the high priest wore. Also in there, Leviticus, you have the first service. The priests have been purified. The people have been bringing their offerings. And very quickly, the priesthood, there's a problem. Nadab and Abihu offer fire that God did not authorize, or an offering, and of course they die. And God tells part of the reason why there, and I think there are several factors that are in it. And then you have Eleazar and Ithamar who bring offerings, but what they do is they don't do the offering as God required. They were in a rush. They were in a hurry because, oh no, look what happened to Nadab and Abihu. We got to make things right. And so out of impatience, but God is very gracious with them. So that is Leviticus. As we got into the book of Numbers, really basically three major divisions within that book. You have the organizing of the first generation, so a census. Numbers is about numbering. It's about a census. So the first census is taken, and then you have the rebellion of the people of Israel, and then they go into 40 years wanderings, and when they come out, there's a second census that is taken. as well as a preparing of the people of Israel of the second generation. And what's interesting in that is the amount of people that went down into the wilderness for the 40 years and they died. The ones who come out of that, the population is basically the same. So you can see how God was faithful in sustaining them. And interestingly, in each of the books that we've gone through, one of the things that we've seen over and over again as a theme is the faithfulness of God. God's faithfulness to his people. And of course, a lot of it is faithful during times when the people are not living as they should. I think that is one of the most underrated and undervalued attributes of God is his faithfulness. So a very important part of Numbers. In Numbers, the Levites are given duties as far as things that they are to do. They celebrate a Passover there. And then you, of course, have the rebellion of the first generation. And then you have the second generation, and it brings us to the book of Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we see some major divisions, which is the renewal of the Mosaic covenant. So the first generation dies. The second generation says, we will follow the Lord. We will be obedient to him. Within that, as you see the covenant being renewed, there are many stipulations that are given to them in the book of Deuteronomy. And then what Deuteronomy covers in about the second or the last third of the book is that there's an exhortation to the people to follow the law, but there's also a laying out of the blessings and the cursings. And so here it is, if the nation of Israel does what is right, here's what God will do for you. But if you disobey God's covenant, then here are the negative things. Here's the consequences or the cursings. And then you have a witnessing to the covenant. So an official ceremony, if you want to say, where that there are witnesses there to certify this is what we are doing, and we are entering into this covenant. And with that being settled, Moses is going to die. He's not allowed to enter into the land because of when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. And so you have at the end of Deuteronomy where Moses is going off the scene, and God appoints Joshua to be the next leader of Israel. And Joshua takes over that leadership. God is the one who buries Moses. No, Moses dies. He was up on a mountain, and God buried him. We have no idea where Moses was actually buried. That's kind of an interesting thing. And so that is the book of Deuteronomy. As we come to Joshua, this is where he prepares the people for inheriting the land. They then cross the Jordan River. You have the 3 campaigns, and they now take up residence in the land. And then Joshua allots the land to them, and then Joshua gives 2 speeches. One is to the leaders of the people, and he's basically encouraging them to follow the Lord. And then the second message is to all the people of Israel and encouraging them to follow the Lord. But he also tells them, since you're agreeing to this, you also need to put away the gods. So they had all that time, all the time from when they came out of Egypt, they brought with them their gods. And so they've had them even during the 40 years of the wanderings. Up to this point, they still had them. And Joshua is telling them this needs to be put away with. And so that is the book of Joshua. As we come into the book of Judges, we have what is called the cycle. So it begins with kind of the first 3 chapters of somewhat of a summary. A summary of what was going on with the people of Israel and their failure to conquer the Canaanites. Why is it that they go from honoring God during the days of Joshua to where now there is these systemic failures that are taking place? And so Judges really summarizes a lot of the failures. You then get into the actual judges themselves, in which you have cycles of apostasy and deliverance. So as we said already, the people would fall away from God. God would, as he said, send a nation to oppress them. Then they cry out to God for help. God would send a judge who would deliver them. Then there'd be peace in the land, and the cycle would start all over. But then when you come to the end of the book of Judges, it moves away from the actual judges to two different situations that really shows how Israel has degenerated religiously and morally. And so you have Micah, who wants to set up kind of a parallel religion, and there's a Levite who comes along and says, yeah, I'll be the priest that you're looking for. And then, of course, you have the tribe of Dan, who's looking for land, and they take the gods from Micah, and then they conquer some land up north, and they decide this is where we're going to live. And then you have a Levite and his concubine, and the concubine is basically murdered. And so what he does is that he chops her up into 12 pieces because he can't get justice. No one cares about justice. And so when each of the tribes in the male receive a piece of his concubine, what's going on here? Well, they find out what has happened. And they say, well, there needs to be justice. So they get a contingency of men together and go down to the tribe of Benjamin and say, you need to turn over the men who've done this. And they say, we're not going to. So it results in war. And the tribe of Benjamin is almost wiped out. And so what they do is they come to realize afterwards, oh no, what did we do? Benjamin's no longer going to exist. We need to keep this tribe around. And so we need to do something. So they go and conquer a city, take 400 of the young ladies, bring them back, and say to the men of Benjamin that are left, marry these women and have children so that the tribe of Benjamin can continue. And so that is what takes place in the book of Judges. And then, of course, with Ruth, Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges, and there's really the tragedy and the suffering of Naomi. And then it moves to where they come back to Bethlehem, and that is where Ruth meets Boaz while she's gleaning the field. In chapter 3, the proposal to Boaz is made, will you be the kinsman redeemer? And Boaz says, I will, but, however, though, the stipulation is it must be the one who's the closest. And I am not the closest, there's one who's closer than me. So Boaz actually goes to him and says, will you do this? And he refuses. And so the ceremony takes place, or judicial ceremony takes place, and Boaz officially becomes Ruth's redeemer, as well as he redeems the land as well. And really, I think Ruth is a wonderful picture of God towards the nation of Israel, and how gracious and how kind God is as redeemer of his people. So that is the book of Ruth. So that is really a kind of a summation of the major divisions that we find on each and every one of the books. And so as we kind of go back to Genesis, we see some of the major themes that take place. I've got to go all the way back. Some of the major themes that take place in Genesis. And, where are they? Okay, I don't have them right there. Okay, so as we get into Exodus then, major themes that we have in Exodus is that of deliverance, salvation from servitude or bondage. And then we looked at the holiness of God. And then we also saw that the name of God, Yahweh, or I Am, comes to the forefront, where Yahweh, and that He is sufficient in of Himself. He's everything, but He is everything to us. And so Yahweh is very important because He is our sufficiency. And that is major themes that we've seen in the book of Exodus. As we look at Leviticus and the themes there, once again, the holiness of God that is to be reflected in daily life of Israel is one of the themes. And of course, Leviticus is also about the priesthood and having a right relationship with God. So how they are to be in a right relationship, how they're to worship Yahweh is a major theme of Leviticus. And if they worshiped Yahweh and they were in a right relationship to Him, you see His presence, His protection, and His blessing upon the people of Israel. And so that is some of the themes that we find there. And then in Numbers, a couple major themes is once again the sufficiency of Yahweh, but you also have His faithfulness and also His mercy. But you find in that very quickly after the signing of the covenant, and you have the people of Israel refusing to go into the land. And what's interesting is I think you find there rebellion. But it's not just the fact that this is a one-time thing. Rebellion is rooted in human nature. Even during the 40 years of wandering, they are still rebelling towards God, rebelling against God. And even after coming out of the 40 years, there's still some rebellion by the people of Israel. And you would think, well, didn't they learn their lesson? I mean, wouldn't that be the case that once God says, here's what's happening, here's your sin, that all of a sudden, you know what, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to be perfect from this day forward. But very quickly they fall again. And it tells us a lot about human nature. And we have that human nature within us, a propensity to fall away from God as well. In the book of Deuteronomy, you have God's sovereignty and His faithfulness. He brings them out of the 40 years, and He shows His faithfulness to them. And then, really, with Israel, it's about blessings. Blessings for exclusively loving God, but there's also cursings for disobeying God. And I think that it is a basic principle throughout the Bible that those who honor God, God will honor them. God will bless them. But those who depart from God, life's going to be hard. There's going to be some difficulties. And so disobedience to God has consequences. And that is just a basic principle. With the book of Joshua, God's covenant faithfulness. God's bringing them into the land that He promised 42 years ago. But also, in a way, it goes all the way back to the Abrahamic Covenant. This is not the fulfilling of the Abrahamic Covenant, but it shows us how God has been taking care of His people, how God has been loyal to the covenant that He has made with the people of Israel. We also find the importance of trusting God in His Word. That's what Joshua is told. Trust God, stay with His Word, and that is where you as a people and as individuals will have success. And then, of course, the idea of strength and courage and not to fear. It occurs several times in the book of Joshua. So yeah, things may be difficult, but we need to be strong. We need to be courageous, and we don't need to fear. And then when we get into Judges, the major themes there, God is faithful. God forgives. You see the cycle over and over again, yet God is being faithful to them, and God is continually forgiving them. And isn't that wonderful with God? Is that God is second chances, God of third and fourth and fifth. And I wonder how many times we've messed up in our lives, but God has remained faithful to us, and He forgives us every time we confess our sin. How wonderful God is and how faithful He is. And then one of the other things that we see in the book of Judges is that they didn't follow God's law to a T. There was, in a way, what we would call partial or incomplete obedience. And actually, incomplete obedience is disobedience. And when the people of Israel only did part of what God required of them, it was actually setting them up for failure later on. And so you see the ripple effects for disobeying God go a long way. And I think that's what Judges establishes, especially in the first 3 chapters. But there's also another problem that the people were warned of by Joshua when they went into the land, and even by Moses in Deuteronomy, is one of the big struggles that they were going to have is to not be like the cultures around them. And their chief struggle seems to be that they are to resist absorbing the culture. And of course, they did not, and it led to their apostasy. And then you also have towards the second half of the book, the propensity of man to do what he considers right. Man does what is right in his own eyes. Instead of Israel trusting God, they said, there's got to be a better way to do this. We can do this, and so how can we do and accomplish the goal ourselves? And so they're doing this apart from God and doing it in a way of which they consider to be the right thing. And then, of course, Israel's sinful cycles of apostasy, the consequences, and what goes on from there. And then Ruth, as we talked about the major themes there, it's that big Hebrew word, hesed. It is basically all the words that we think of in the New Testament, and then some, all rolled together into one word. Love, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, love, mercy, grace, forgiveness. I mean, all these attributes and things of God are all in this one big Hebrew word, hesed. And we see that in the book of Ruth, the hesed of God. But you also see the sovereignty of God, that with all the things that are going on, yet God's hand is working in all the events. And it's not a thing of chance or of luck that Ruth meets Boaz. It's not chance or a luck that, and you can go through the book of Ruth, it's actually the sovereignty of God. There's no such thing as luck. There's no such thing as the idea of fate in the way that's thought of today. It's all the sovereignty of God at work. And then in Ruth you see suffering and redemption. The suffering of Naomi, the suffering of Ruth, and then Boaz redeeming Ruth. So you have suffering and redemption. And what a wonderful picture it is of for the people of Israel especially. They are still suffering today because of their disobedience to God. But there's going to be a day in which they will become God's focus again. And the idea of the redemption of the people of Israel. And then we can think of it on the human scale. Sin entered into the human race. But God sent his Son for what purpose? For redemption. And so we have salvation beyond just the people of Israel. A lot of stuff we covered in each of these books. And that really concludes kind of the major things that we have gone through. And so next week, Ed Woods will be with us, so we won't be having the normal Sunday school class. But the week following, we'll get into the kings and prophets. And we're not going to cover it from a book standpoint. I'll kind of talk about what each book contains. But we're going to look at it more from going through succession of the judges, of the kings, and then of the prophets that go along with them. So we'll kind of deal with it in two different ways there. All right, let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for being able to be here this morning and just to kind of go back over the things that we have covered. And may, Lord, it help solidify some things that we know already or some things that we have learned. And help us especially with each of these things. While we see a lot of facts that we've gone over, yet we've seen your attributes, we see your sovereignty, we see your love, we see redemption. And God, may we more than anything else be just impressed by your greatness. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.